Hello, hello, and now it's time for analysis of Philippians 3:8 through 9 in Greek. The syntactical analysis. You'll know what it means after you see it. I was going to do through verse 11, but it took me so long to get through verses 8 and 9 that I thought I'd stop there. And of course, it'd be good for you to practice beyond 8 and 9. So this will get you going. You'll get to see what I mean when I talk about doing syntactical analysis. So let's start at the very edge of 3:8. Hegumai, skubala, our favorite Greek word, skubala, the word for crap. But anyway, I consider them dung. We'll go with dung. How's that? I consider them dung. Paul, of course, is talking about whatever might be to his credit as a Jew, his CV, his resume. He had a pretty good resume as a Jew. But whatever might have been considered to his advantage, he considers them dung. And the word them is implied. We need it in English to make good sense of it. So let's look at hegumai. Hegumai is present, middle deponent. The word is hegumai, so it's deponent. Present, middle deponent, indicative, first person singular. Okay, and we might translate it, I consider my advantages to be skubala. Now, here's what I mean by analysis. So we said that hegumai is present. What kind of a present is it? And here, one moment please, something like mounts, or this is Wallace, I'm sorry, the basics of New Testament syntax. I use Brooks and Winberry, which I find more short and sweet and hard to beat, although I think it's gone out of print. Donovan killed it. It's a conspiracy. But anyway, any kind of intermediate grammar will help you to see what some of the options are. Different grammars might use slightly different language, but it's roughly the same thing because they're all pointing to the same basic truth, the same basic reality. So I debated, I'm going to call this a simple, Wallace calls it an aoristic or an immediate present. I don't get the feeling that this should be translated, I am considering them. That just doesn't sound quite, that sounds too much. Just to say I consider them to be dung sounds more right, and that's just a simple, what we might call aoristic present. I consider. Just no real connotation to it all. I don't think that I have considered them dung, kind of a durative or a perfective present. I mean, those all seem like over-reading it. It just seems like he's saying, I consider my credentials dung. Simple present. So I'm going with simple present. By the way, I may be wrong on some of these. I probably have had more experience than anybody watching this video, but that doesn't mean that I'm right. Believe me, that doesn't mean that I'm right. I debate these things. But I want you to get a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about an analysis that goes beyond parsing to trying to get the nuance of the tenses and cases and so forth. Simple active, there are a couple other actives I won't go into, but simple active basically means the normal, the subject is doing the verb. I consider. It's not I am considered, or it's not I consider myself. It's none of those. It's just I consider. It's not I cause to consider. There's a causative active. It's just a plain old simple active, I consider. Now, indicative. What is the sense of the indicative here? Well, this is a plain old declaration. I consider. It's not may I consider or I should consider. You know, might that I consider. It's nothing like that. It's a straight old declarative indicative. I consider. So, even though I've attached labels to this word, hegumai, labels that you may have never heard of before, they basically are saying there's nothing really special about this word. It's just a plain old present and a plain old active and a plain old indicative. I consider, period. Okay, so let's look at skubala. Skubala is accusative, neuter plural. It's a neuter plural alpha from skubalon, the singular for dung. So skubalon is one, I don't know how you have one bit of dung. But skubala is a pile of dung. I consider it a pile of manure for the sake of Christ. So anyway, I'm calling this double accusative because of the implied them. I consider it's like the rock skips twice. So skubala is a kind of a direct object, but it's like a secondary. So I consider them to be dung. So it's kind of a secondary hit on the pond, and that's what we call a double accusative. Wallace has a couple of double accusatives in here. This would be the one that he calls a double accusative with object complement or something like that, because you have an object and then you have a complement that tells you about the object. So the object would be them. I consider what? I consider them to be dung, the complement. Anyway, double accusative because they're like two accusatives after this verb. That's, I don't know, a shaky way to begin, but that's the beginning of all sorrows. Let's go on to the next part. This is a clause. In order that I might gain Christ. Or if you go in the order, in order that Christ I might gain. But we know enough about Greek to know that Christon is the direct object, and that when we bring it into English, we're going to put it last. So hina, or hina, I'm not sure if that's a long iota. After this many years, I should know whether that's a long iota or not. But hina is a subordinating conjunction. That means that it's not a conjunction that combines cars that are on an equal footage, but it basically drags along a clause that won't stand on its own. So the clause, in order that I might gain Christ, is not a sentence. It's a fragment. And that tells me that hina is a subordinating conjunction. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It has to be connected to some other clause. And also, when I see hina in the New Testament, I know that a subjunctive verb is coming. In this case, kurdeso, because hina only takes the subjunctive in the New Testament. In classical Greek, it can do something else, but I'm not going to tell you about that. Kurdeso is the verb. Its parsing is, it's an aorist, it's active, it's subjunctive, first singular from kurdano. So sigma in the indicative mood indicates future, but a sigma in the aorist mood indicates, but a sigma in the subjunctive indicates an aorist. So it's an aorist. The sigma tells me so. But anyway, so what kind of a subjunctive is it? Well, the hina suggests that it is a subjunctive of purpose. Hina introduces a purpose clause. In order that, why do I consider them skubala? I consider them skubala in order that I might gain Christ. So it is a subjunctive of purpose. There are other words you should probably know. It's a final subjunctive, a telic subjunctive. Those are all different ways that different grammarians refer to purpose kinds of clauses. So it's aorist. What kind of an aorist is it? I think it's just basically a blah aorist. It just says, in order that I might gain Christ, period. So there's no special nuance to the aorist here, I don't think. And so the basic, I probably, if I were inventing the language, I would probably call this a simple aorist. But the word that is most often used by grammarians to refer to a kind of a simple aorist is a constantive aorist. And that just basically means there's no special nuance. And there's no special nuance to the active either. It's just a simple active. So again, I'm sorry, I'm underwhelming you, aren't I? This is an aorist without any special thing. It's an active without any special thing. It is a purpose, a subjunctive of purpose. And that is something, hopefully, that you remember from the rest of Philippians. Okay, Christ. Won't I ever get through this verse? This is why I didn't end up doing more verses, because if you analyze everything, especially when you're typing it into a PowerPoint, it's going to take a while. It'd be much easier to write it down on paper, as far as I'm concerned. Well, Christon is accusative masculine singular, as you know. We're going to call this an accusative of direct object. Before you would have just called it a direct object, but that's the function of the accusative case here. In order that I might gain what? In order that I might gain Christ. Christ is the direct object of the verb, and we call that an accusative of direct object. Okay, this concludes verse, was it verse 8? So now we move on to, I believe, the beginning of verse 9, 3:9. What is the background? In order that I consider them skubala, in order that I might gain Christ and might be found in him. 3:9, the beginning of 3:9. So this is continuing on from the hina. So the hina governs not only kerdeso, in order that I might gain, but also in order that I might find. So the hina goes with two, it's a compound clause here. Kai is a coordinating conjunction, unlike hina, which is a subordinating conjunction. Kai joins two things of equal status. It coordinates two things of equal status. So the two things it's coordinating here is kerdeso and huretho. So two verbs of equal status. It coordinates them. It's the coordinator, kai. Huretho, get the accent in the right place. Huretho is aorist. It's, actually I'm wrong. It's not active. I was just testing you. Did you catch it before I caught it? The theta there indicates that it's aorist passive subjunctive. Oh, woe is me. I'm not perfect. I hate that. I'm going to give myself 30 lashes after the video. So huretho is aorist passive subjunctive, first person singular from heurisco. What kind of a subjunctive is it? Well, because it follows on hina, it's a subjunctive of purpose. Surprise! Just like kerdeso was. Again, I don't think there's any particular nuance to the aorist. It's a bleh aorist. I would call it a simple aorist if I was making up the words, but the word that they use is constantive aorist. And a constantive aorist basically just looks at the event from a holistic perspective. They used to call this a punctiliar kind of perspective. And it's a simple active. Nothing to see here. Go home. En-auto is a prepositional phrase. I hope you knew that. With en being a preposition. It modifies might be found. En-auto, as you know, means in him. So that I might be found. How might I be found? Or where might I be found? In him is where I might be found. So it's a prepositional phrase that is functioning adverbially, because it's telling us about the verb. It might be found. I might be found. So there you have it. En is a preposition. Auto is a personal pronoun. I hope you noticed that, even though I didn't put it in the PowerPoint. It's a personal pronoun. It's dative, masculine, singular. Now, a pronoun has an antecedent. It's telling us about something that came before. Who's the him here? Well, the him is Christ. Christ is the antecedent. In Christ, that is. In order that I might be found in Christ. In Christ is a very special and frequent phrase for Paul. I'm going to call this a dative of sphere because it's telling me, as it were, a location. But it's not telling me a location in space, and it's not telling me a location in time. This is an abstract location, to be in Christ. And so when you have an abstract location, you call it a sphere, a dative of sphere. Now, I put locative function after that is because the dative case actually has three distinct kinds of nuances. Actually, in the history of Indo-European languages, if you go back before Greek, Sanskrit, for example, is an Indian language that represents an earlier form of this great Indo-European language. But what is now in Greek, the dative case, was originally three separate cases in the history of the Indo-European language. So there was the dative proper, there was the instrumental case that had to do with kind of by means of, and then there's this location, locative it's called, function, that used to be a case. Now datives do all three of these things. Datives express interest in the dative proper, they express location, and they express means. If that was unclear, don't worry. This is like the first shot at this kind of analysis, so all things will become clear over time. So we call this a dative of sphere because it's telling the sphere in which I might be found. Where, oh where will you be found? You'll be found in Christ, in the sphere of Christ. Not because he's not a place or a time. We call it a sphere. It's more abstract. So this is called a dative of sphere, and that's a location, right? It's a kind of abstract location. So that's what we mean when we say this is a locative function, that the dative case. It's almost like you have the dative case, and then within the dative case you have datives that express location, and then within datives that express location you have those that express sphere. They all express sphere, of course, but a sphere is a place, abstract place. Okay, that didn't make any sense. We'll have another chance, I'm sure. Okay, we go on to the next line. In order that I might be found in him, not having my righteousness, which is from the law. So, may is an adverb. U is used with indicative verbs. May is used with non-indicative verbs and verbals. I say verbals because may goes with a participle here. By the way, it is possible to have U with a participle, but it's very infrequent in the New Testament. Generally, in the New Testament, may is used with pretty much every participle in the New Testament. But maybe I shouldn't even have told you that. The best thing to think when you're starting out is that participles use may every time. It's a lie, but you'll mostly be okay if you think of it that way. So may means not having. Ekon is a present active participle. It is nominative masculine singular from, surprise, echo. Okay? So what's the nuance of the participle here? Well, it's an adverbial participle because it's telling us, again, something about might be found. Might be found how might we be found? We might be found not having. If it were a adjectival participle, then we'd probably use like who or which. But we don't, it's not. It would usually have the article on it if it was adjectival, usually. So this is an adverbial participle. It's telling you something about how we might be found. So I would call it a manner, or you might call it a modal. I think some grammars call this a modal adverbial participle. Or if you want to call it a manner adverbial participle, like our good friend Dan Wallace, then that's probably is easier to remember, because he's telling them, Paul's telling the manner in which I might be found. In what way might you be found? I might be found not having my own righteousness. So this is an adverbial participle telling us about how I'm going to be found, and it's a adverbial participle of manner because it's telling me how I might be found. Again, watch this video a couple times, or if you don't get it this time, you'll get it the second time. If you don't get it the second time, you'll get it the third time as we continue to do these analyses. I'm going to just call it a simple present, or an heuristic present. I don't think there's any particular nuance of the present tense here. It expresses, when you get into participle land, the tense of the participle more expresses the relative time to the verb. So in order that I might not be found, not having, present tense means the same time as the verb, and the verb I might be found is subjunctive, so it's not very time. So the whole time dimension of this participle seems to be more or less out the window. But anyway, I mean, there could be a continuous dimension to it. We can debate that. I mean, I'm just not sure. In order that I might be found continuously not having, I mean, that just seems to overread it to me. So let's just go with the blah present for now. Simple active, blah active. Nothing special about the active. Okay, I had to go to a second one. Not having my righteousness from the law. Not having my own righteousness on the basis of law or from the law. Something like that is how we would translate it. So dikaiosune is accusative feminine singular. It's from dikaiosune. It means righteousness. It's the accusative direct object. Not having what? Not having righteousness. So it's the direct object of that participle. Amen is a possessive adjective. Normally, Greek does the righteousness of me, but Paul decided to go a little flowery here, and so he used the form that actually is more similar to what we do in English. In English, we tend to do my righteousness. That's the way we do it in English, rather than the righteousness of me. The righteousness of me doesn't sound right in English. And in Greek, usually you would say the righteousness of me, but Paul, because of this complex kind of pretty thing he's doing, he goes with my righteousness here. So we call that a possessive adjective because it's mine. And it's used attributively because it goes right on the noun, my righteousness. It's not I am righteousness, it's my righteousness. They go together like a horse and carriage, and we call that attributive, the attributive use of an adjective. Okay, tain ek namu, I like to think of this this second article kind of tacking this prepositional phrase onto dikaiosune. You might even translate it with which, even though it's just the word the from law one. So it's my righteousness, the from law one. So tain ek namu is the attributive use of a prepositional phrase. It's as if it's an adjective. So if you wanted to say the green righteousness, one way you could say the green righteousness is to say righteousness, the green one. So Paul has done that here with from the law. Righteousness, the from law one. The from law righteousness. That's the attributive. It's like an adjective. It's telling us what kind of righteousness are we talking about here. We're talking about the from law righteousness. So this is called the attributive use of a prepositional phrase. Tain is a feminine accusative singular article, the, from ha. It matches dikaiosune in case, number, and gender, as we would expect. Ek is a preposition, surprisingly, which finally leads us to namu. Namu is a genitive masculine singular noun from namas, meaning law. And so, this is a genitive of source. What basically Paul is saying is he wants to be found not having my own righteousness that is from the law, with law as the source of righteousness here. Paul is basically saying the law is not a source of righteousness, and therefore Paul is not aiming to be found with a righteousness that comes from law, because if he does that, he's not going to be acceptable in God's sight. And so law is not the source of Paul's righteousness. So we call this a genitive of source, from the law. This law is the source. Now, remember how I said the dative combines what were originally 3 cases historically? The genitive case combines what was originally 2 different cases in our great Indo-European ancestors. So in Sanskrit, there are 2 cases, a genitive case and an ablative case, which correspond. They've both been combined into the genitive case in Greek, in the Greek language. So you might say that when a genitive is used to express source from law, that's what's called the ablatival function of the genitive case. So you have the genitive proper, and then you have the ablatival function. So again, if you were to draw a circle, so you have all the genitives, and then you have those genitives that are ablatival in nature, and then within that you have those that function as a genitive of source. Actually, source is kind of the root sense of source, or maybe even separation. Let's say separation. Separation is kind of the root idea of the ablatival genitives. If you don't understand that, don't worry. All you need to know is that this is a genitive of source, the law as the potential source of righteousness. Okay, so now we get the second half. Not having my righteousness on the basis of law or from law, but my righteousness, or a righteousness that is tain dia pisteos Christou, a righteousness that is through faith of Christ. Allah is also a coordinating conjunction. In this case, we're not talking about the God of Islam, but we're talking about the conjunction that means but. So Allah is a coordinating conjunction because it says not this but this, two things on an equal level. It's obviously involves a contrast, so it's not a coupling kind of word, but a contrasting kind of word. Conjunction. Tein dia pisteos Christou. It also goes with righteousness. So it's another attributive use of a prepositional phrase because, again, Paul doesn't repeat all the words. They're understood. So, but a righteousness that is through the faith of Jesus Christ. Not having my righteousness the from law, but the through faith. So he wants to have the through faith righteousness, not the from law righteousness. So this tein dia pisteos Christou also goes with the word righteousness. It is another attributive use, that is the good man, another attributive use of a prepositional phrase. Tein is again a feminine accusative singular article, the, ha, matching dikaiosune, and dia is a preposition. Yay! So now we get to pisteos Christou, which is, of course, a firestorm of biblical debate. Pisteos is genitive feminine singular from pistis. Everybody agrees with that. And everybody would agree that pisteos is a genitive of means. That is to say that it is through a righteousness that comes through faith, by means of faith. This is a ablatival function, by the way. I didn't put that there. But if you say some genitives are genitive and some genitives are ablative, this would be an ablatival function to express means or agency. We call it means when it's an impersonal thing. That's the means. And we say agent when it's a person that's doing it. Faith is a instrument rather than a person. So, through faith. That's how. A righteousness that is through faith of Christ. Christou is obviously genitive masculine singular from Christos. However, what kind of a genitive is it? And here's where we get into great debates. I personally go with those who think that I think that when, it's very interesting to me, in the three places where Paul broaches this phrase, he always begins with the expression dia pisteos. I wonder if this is a stock phrase, that he is drawing on a phrase from his environment, a traditional phrase. I go with the subjective genitive for this first one, through the faithfulness of Christ. So that means if it's the faithfulness of Christ, then it's Christ's having faith. So Christ is, as it were, the subject of this noun, and we call that a subjective genitive. The other option is, of course, that it is through faith directed in Christ, faith in Christ. That's the objective genitive. I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't disagree with that theologically, but after agonizing over this for a number of years, I finally at some point decided that I do think that the lead-off instances of this expression in Romans 3:22 and Galatians 2:16 and here in Philippians 3:9, that the lead-off pistis Christou in each case is a subjective genitive. Again, I don't disagree with the other option theologically. I've come to believe that Paul always starts off this train of thought with what we call a subjective genitive, the faithfulness of Christ. Christ is the subject, having faith. Now, this next expression is very interesting because in this second expression, Paul brings out conjunctions that make the traditional theology clear. So my claim is that Paul moves from kind of the newfangled interpretation to the old-fashioned interpretation. But someone might say, you might say, well, he's just clarifying what was ambiguous in the previous statement. That's called epexegetical, where you basically say something that repeats the first thing in a way that clarifies it. So that way of reading it would say something like this: but righteousness that is through faith in Christ, namely a righteousness that is from God on the basis of faith, where he's just basically saying the same thing twice, and the second time he says it clear. I personally have come to believe that, or to wonder, if Paul starts with that, namely a righteousness that is through the faithfulness of Christ, and then moves to the more traditional Protestant interpretation, namely a righteousness from God that is on the basis of our faith. Two options here. Is this just basically saying the same thing as what's come before, or is he balancing out the previous phrase with the believer's side to the equation? So that the first phrase would say, through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, and then it would say, on the basis of our faith. I like it. So, grammatically, for sure, we can say that tein ek theou dikaiasunein is the attributive use of a prepositional phrase. It's article, adjective, noun, where ek theou is functioning as an adjective. So if I let me go back to the purple righteousness or the blue righteousness, whatever you want to say. That's an attributive construction, the blue righteousness. Except here it's the from God righteousness, the righteousness which is from God, something like that. That's called the attributive use, the good dog, the good horse, the good man. That's a traditional attributive kind of use of a prepositional phrase. Tein dikaiasune, Paul has been so flowery that he repeats the word in case you lost track of what he was talking about. The righteousness, namely, that is from God. He repeats it, brings it up so that you remember what it was he was talking about from earlier in the train of thought. The from God righteousness, ek theou, is a preposition ek with a genitive of source again, because God is the one from whom the righteousness is coming. The right, and I think here he means a right standing. The right standing from God. I think that's what he's saying here. I don't think he's talking about actually God giving us righteousness, but I think he's talking about God granting us a right standing here. The right standing from God, if you would. So ek is theou is the source. And again, when you have a genitive of source, that's the kind of ablative function of the genitive case. So God is the source of this righteousness, not the law. He doesn't want to be found with my righteousness from law, but the righteousness from God. Theou is genitive, masculine, singular, just to tighten up all the hatches here. Okay, and finally, in verse 9, epi te piste, on the basis of faith. Epi is a preposition. This prepositional phrase, again, is telling us about being found on the basis of faith. So it's again, functioning adverbially. Te piste is dative feminine singular, and I would say that this is a dative of a means. So again, this is kind of the instrumental type of dative. There's a dative proper, an instrumental dative, and a locative dative. So this is the basic dative of means, the instrumental dative, as it were, on the basis of faith, by means of faith, on the basis of faith is how that righteousness is granted from God. And again, I think human faith is in view here. Richard Hayes of Duke Divinity School, I think he sees it as Christ's faith pretty much throughout. Okay, well, this has been a very detailed analysis of the last part of Philippians 3:8 and Philippians 3:9, and I hope this begins to help you get a sense of what I mean by doing analysis of Greek sentences.